On August 18th of 1697, the Russian Tsar Peter the Great arrives incognito in the Dutch port town of Zaandam. The purpose of the journey? To learn how to build ships. Sure, it may sound rather unconventional, but that was Peter's entire expedition to Western Europe. It was the first time the Tsar had ever left Russia in peacetime, and for 18 long months. It was also the first time he attempted to establish real diplomatic relations with rulers from England to Vienna. And of course, it was the first time that a powerful ruler of the Russian Empire decided to find out for himself what it took to build good ships. Peter the Great spent several months in the docks of Zaandam and then Amsterdam. Within a few years, Russia, a country that originally had only one port, would become a naval power. Peter Alexeyevich was born on June 9, 1672, to the second wife of Tsar Alexei I Mikhailovich, Natalia Kirillovna Narishkina. His father died 3.5 years later, and Peter's older half-brother Fyodor ascended the Russian throne. But after 6 years, he too died, and since he left no descendants, a struggle broke out in the empire as to which of the brothers would succeed him at the head of the country. The elderly but mentally ill Ivan from his father's first marriage, or his only 10-year-old half-brother Peter. The Boyar Duma, the highest state body, eventually voted for Peter. But Ivan's sister Sofia in particular was not going to give up without a fight. She managed to get Moscow's military units, called the Rifles, on her brother's side, and with their help she eventually achieved at least a partial victory. Peter and Ivan would rule together. But the reality is quite different. Sick Ivan and little Peter are a charm. In reality, Sofia, who is appointed as their regent, makes all the decisions. It is even said that the joint throne had a hole cut in the back so that she could eavesdrop on important conversations and whisper answers to her brothers. But Peter doesn't mind too much. He's more into playing with ships or his small, albeit real army, the so-called pleasure regiments, than ruling. At 17, however, his mother decides that it is time for him to start taking his role seriously and marries him off to Yevdokia Lopukina, daughter of the noble Boyar. In the same year, Peter sent his half-sister Sofia, who had ruled for him and Ivan until then, into seclusion in the monastery. But even now, he is not a ruler in the true sense of the word. His mother makes all the decisions for him for a change. It was only after her death in 1694 that Peter became the true ruler of his country. And then, when his half-brother Ivan dies 2 years later, Peter can finally get down to the business of reforming backward Russia. Here it is necessary to remember in what condition Peter took over Russia. A country of 35 million people had not only a poor infrastructure but also a poor international standing. The new Tsar wanted to change all that. His first goal was to realize his childhood dream, to make Russia a naval power. It was a difficult task. His country had only one port at the time, Arkhangelsk. So in 1695, Peter tried to gain access to the Azov Sea and with it the Black Sea. Although the campaign against the Turks is unsuccessful, Peter does not give up. In July 1696, he returned, conquered Azov for the second time, and later established the naval base of Taganrog. The first of his successes is in the world. Under the Ottomans, it becomes clear that Peter will need allies in addition to a strong army if he is to expand further. In 1697, he and his retinue set off for Western Europe to hold diplomatic talks with other rulers. At the same time, he does not want the word to get out that the Tsar has abandoned his empire. So he makes the journey under the pseudonym Pyotr Mikhailov. But few are fooled by him. At 6 feet tall, Tsar Peter the Great is hardly interchangeable. Although he enjoys the trip as an admirer of Western culture, the political talk doesn't go quite as planned. Most monarchs are reluctant to cross the Turks, and moreover, Peter has chosen a rather unfortunate time for his mission. European monarchs are more interested in events in the south, where a war over the Spanish inheritance is brewing. Thus, Peter spends part of his stay, for which the name of the Great Embassy has been adopted, in the Mediterranean docks, where he learns to build good ships. for example at the Dutch East India Company. But in 1698 he has to give up everything and immediately head back to Russia. He receives news that the gunners have once again staged a rebellion. By the time Peter returns, the rebellion is put down. Even so, he has about 1,200 of the rebel impaled or tortured, and exiles another part to Siberia. From today's perspective, it is somewhat paradoxical that such a cruelly punishing monarch was at the same time doing everything he could to bring his country up to European standards. For example, he forbade men to wear long beards, which the bearded clergy in particular bore with a heavy heart. Many preferred to pay a special tax to avoid the obligation to shave. But other and more painful taxes followed. For example, the so-called head tax, which had to be paid even by the practically unmaitish serfs, who made up a full 80% of the Russian population. Peter is also reforming the state structure. For example, instead of the traditional Boyar Duma, he is introducing a Senate. This is composed of 10 men, all of whom are personally selected by the Tsar himself. The new body is thus at his disposal. In the following years, after the death of the Moscow Patriarch, Peter refuses to appoint a new head of the Orthodox Church and creates the position of Grand Prosecutor. This role is filled by a secular official who also acts as the highest spiritual leader. Through all his reforms, Peter thus gains virtually unlimited power. The term autocracy has come to be used in Russia for this state model, but Peter the Great himself longs to go further. Unable to find allies for the war with the Ottoman Empire, Peter made a temporary peace with the Turks, and in 1699 joined forces with Denmark, Norway, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Saxony. Thus began the long 21 years of fighting against Sweden that would later go down in history as the Great Northern War. Against the Russian coalition stands the only 17-year-old Swedish king Charles XII, but he proves to be a stronger opponent than anyone expected. He wins the Battle of Narva in 1700, but Peter is not deterred. Gradually, the Russians begin to make their way along the Neva River to its mouth in the Baltic Sea, and Peter's dream of a great Russian fleet takes on a slightly clearer outline. The mouth of the Neva River is a strategically advantageous location, but it lies practically on the Arctic Circle in the middle of the swamps. Nevertheless, Peter decides to found a new city here, which will become the showcase of the Russian Empire. Thousands of workers die in the construction of St. Petersburg because of the desperate conditions. But on the banks of the Baltic, a city is gradually rising to be a kind of window to the west and to send a clear message to Europe. Backward and militarily incapable of Russia just passed. Over the next 10 years, Peter manages to get involved with the Ottomans again. In 1709, Sultan Ahmed III shelters the wounded Swedish king and refuses to hand over his ally. The new fighting eventually ends with the signing of the so-called Treaty of Prut, which deprives Russia of the port of Azov again after 14 years. Even the personal life of Peter the Great is full of twists and turns. His first wife Yevdokia bore him 3 children, but only the eldest, Alexei, lived to adulthood. Moreover, the marriage was not a happy one, and in 1698 Peter forced his wife to retire to a monastery. In 1712 he married Catherine Alexievna, the daughter of a Lithuanian peasant with Polish ancestry. Her original name was Martha Helena Skavronska, but after she accepted Orthodoxy she changed her name according to tradition. She eventually gave birth to 12 children, but most of them died soon. Only 2 daughters, Anna and Elizabeth, lived to maturity. But all the loss of children is nothing compared to the loss of Peter's son Alexei, the only surviving offspring from his first marriage. In 1718, the Tsar accuses him of plotting havoc against him. He then has him tortured, and since Alexei actually confesses, he is to be executed. But he dies before Peter can sign the final sentence. In prison, he succumbs to the effects of brutal torture. Peter thus loses a potential heir, and the country is left wondering who will one day take his place. We are still in 1718. St. Petersburg has been the capital of Russia for 5 years, and the Northern War is still going on. But after 18 years of fighting, the soldiers are tired and increasingly fleeing the front. So Peter comes up with new rules. Every man who is conscripted now has a cross tattooed on his arm, so that the deserter can be recognized immediately. And if he tries to run away from his regiment, his whole unit gets a beating. The war would eventually end in 1721 with the signing of the Treaty of Neustadt, under which Russia would gain the territory around St. Petersburg and present-day Estonia and Latvia, confirming its growing influence. Soon after the war, Peter comes up with another reform. He divides the state administration into 14 classes according to the so-called table of ranks. Until then, for example, clerical positions were hereditary, but now they were to be awarded on merit. The change, which fundamentally affected, for example, the soldiers, brought the much-needed improvement in the bureaucratic apparatus and the efficiency of the army. The results came quickly. In the years 1722 and 23, during the Russo-Persian War, Peter subjugated cities like Derbent and Baku, and the Russian Empire expanded into the Caucasus, beyond the Caucasus, and into the area of today's northern Iran. Peter is now almost 52 years old, and his health problems are gradually starting to limit him. In the summer of 1724, he undergoes bladder surgery and is bedridden for several months. By the autumn, he begins to get better and is again actively involved in the farming of the land. Legend has it that on one of his rounds he saw a drowning soldier and rushed to his aid. But the icy water worsened his difficulties, from which he will not recover this time. The veracity of the story of the Tsar's heroic assistance is debatable, but what is certain is that he had his wife Catherine crowned empress that same year, and the following spring, on the 8th of April in 1725, Peter the Great dies. He managed to transform his empire beyond recognition during his 42 years of rule. He fundamentally changed the dysfunctional bureaucratic structure, introduced the Julian calendar, doubled the number of manufactures. He reorganized the army and navy, carried out currency reform, introduced the silver ruble, established orphanages, and rapidly increased the export of Russian goods. On the other hand, Tsar Peter the Great was a man who did not shy away from witnessing the torture of his only son or sacrificing thousands of lives for the construction of his dreamed city. The ranks of the poorest people also swelled further, and their situation worsened. One thing, however, cannot be denied to Peter the Great. During his reign, the West began to regard backward Russia as an equal partner. And that's something no one before or after him had managed to do for a long time.